Obviously, there's a whole lot in the news about immigration, border security, deportation, amnesty, due process. And rather than do what you're seeing on cable news and broadcast news, people just sort of making it up as they go along, and everybody on social media deciding that they're an expert on all of these things. We thought we'd do something a little different. We thought we'd rather educate ourselves and educate you with an actual expert. So that's what we're going to do, an actual expert on all of these processes. You want to talk about due process in our immigration system? Andrew Arthur is a former immigration judge. He did this every single day. He worked on the House with national security, with border security, with immigration policy, and we're going to have a nice long conversation with him about all this stuff coming up right now. My name's Larry O'Connor, and you can call me Larry. And we're going to get to the show in just a minute. But first, this July, there's a global summit of BRICS nations in Rio de Janeiro. This is the bloc of emerging superpowers, including China, Russia, India, and Iran. They're meeting with the goal of displacing the US dollar as the global currency. Yeah, they're calling this the Rio Reset. Sounds ominous, doesn't it? Well, as BRICS nations push forward with their plans, global demands for US dollars could decrease, bringing down the value of the dollars in your savings. Now, while this transition won't happen overnight, the Rio Reset in July marks a pivotal moment when BRICS objectives may move decisively from theoretical possibility toward inevitable reality. So now what do? You need to diversify into gold. Learn if diversifying your savings into gold is the right step for you. Birch Gold Group can help you move your hard-earned savings into a tax-sheltered IRA in precious metals. Claim your free info kit on gold by texting my name, Larry, to 989898. With an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau and tens of thousands of happy customers, let Birch Gold arm you with a free, no-obligation info kit on owning gold before July and the Rio Reset. Text Larry to 989898. Do it today. And let's get right to it with Andrew Arthur. Now, he's currently a resident fellow in law and policy at the Center for Immigration Studies. But let me just give a quick resume check, Andrew, and you can help me out if I'm wrong. You were, in fact, an immigration judge back in the mid 2000s in York, Pennsylvania. You saw a lot of these immigration cases, deportation rulings, and things like that. You also served on Capitol Hill in multiple capacities, including with the National Security Subcommittee on the House of Representatives in Oversight and Government Reform. That was with Jason Chaffetz and then Subcommittee Chairman Ron DeSantis. We know that guy. And then also, you were on Capitol Hill as an oversight counsel for immigration for Chairman Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin and the House Judiciary Committee in the early 2000s for Homeland Security and Intelligence Reform, Terrorism Prevention. That's when Homeland Security was created in the wake of the 9/11 attack. So, did I get anything wrong? That's a pretty good resume and track record on this issue.
Yeah, no, there are a couple of things you left out that are going to be directly relevant to what we're going to talk about today. I started as a trial attorney in San Francisco with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and I eventually worked my way up to INS headquarters. I was an associate general counsel, and I was chief of the National Security Law Division and an advisor to then Attorney General Janet Reno on immigration issues. So yeah, when you talk about I've handled these issues as an attorney. I've advised officials at the highest ranks of government on these issues, and I was an immigration judge for about 8 years.
Wow.
And of course, if you do the timeline, you'll see that I was actually the Oversight Counsel for Immigration on September 11th. And one of the primary drafters of the Homeland Security Act. So, yeah, I've got a little bit of experience in these areas.
Well, and let's be clear here, because I think that's important. First of all, you pointed out, you mentioned Janet Reno. You have worked for Republican administrations and Democrat administrations with regard to these policies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Up until really the end of the Obama administration, there really wasn't a whole lot of difference. We went from George H.W. Bush, my first president, to Bill Clinton, and nothing really changed. Then we went to George W. Bush, wasn't really a big change there. Barack Obama, up until about 2014, immigration enforcement was one of those things that the White House largely kept its hands off of. didn't get involved, didn't attempt to intermeddle in the way that immigration officers do their business. It was, viewed as a bipartisan thing. Immigration enforcement, national security, local safety, all of those things were considered to be bipartisan issues.
Yeah.
So it was a seamless transition over all of those administrations.
Well, since you went there, let's start with that conversation. What do you think happened? What changed in 2014 that suddenly turned this into such a polarizing political issue?
Yeah, actually, and that's an easy answer. The Democrats had, lost elections in 2010, 2012. They won the presidency in 2012, but they, weren't able to regain their traction in Congress in 2014. And so at the end of November 2014, weeks after that election, Barack Obama's then DHS Secretary Jay Johnson issued guidelines prioritizing immigration enforcement. Those priorities that Secretary Johnson, who's the very good man, I've had the pleasure of meeting him, implemented, really started the restrictions on immigration enforcement. So when you saw Donald Trump run for president in 2016, when he talked about the border and he talked about immigration enforcement, it was really, about the restrictions that had been placed beginning at the end of November 2014 on ICE officers in particular in doing their jobs and deciding which cases to bring. When I was an immigration judge, when I started on the bench in 2006, many of the people, probably half the people that I saw, were, had drug offenses. Many were drug dealers, had, major DUI offenses and had engaged in domestic violence. Sometime around 2012, 2013, and then definitely into 2014, those drunk driving cases, those domestic violence cases, they just didn't show up on my docket anymore. What I got was a lot more border cases, people who had alleged that they had a credible fear of return home. Were in my court telling me about, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, but I also got a lot of more exotic countries. I had a couple of Nepalese cases, Sri Lankans, things like that. The border takes all comers. And as the Obama administration went on and into the Trump administration, those nationalities, started to, those, rarer nationalities started to really get into the mix. But it was
Interesting.
nothing like once Joe Biden showed up. Once Joe Biden showed up, people from all around the world knew that the border was open. If they were going to come, now was the time to come.
Well, and we've seen those famous bar graphs that show exactly what you're talking about, where immediately, boom, like the number of illegal crossings and illegal immigrants just skyrocketed. I just want to be clear on the language here. You said in 2014, Jay Johnson, Homeland Security Secretary under the Obama administration, put restrictions on enforcement, which is a interesting way to say basically they stopped enforcing, right? Or they told the Border Patrol agents and ICE agents and various other law enforcement personnel to stop enforcing the law. That's what you mean by restrictions on enforcement. And you preface that by saying they had lost several elections. So I'm trying to connect these dots. Did they stop enforcing these immigration laws the way they had been and the way prior administrations had been because in some way they saw that policy translating to electoral success for them?
Yeah, it's that's a great question, Larry, and it's one I wish I could answer directly. Uh, you know, they probably viewed an increase in the unauthorized population in the United States or countenancing certain criminal aliens remaining in the United States as something that would give them a political advantage. I don't know what that political advantage was. I wasn't at the highest level of government at that time.
Well, if I may, I mean, it's got to be one of two things. Either they thought that not enforcing the law would curry favor to immigration rights activists and legal voters who wanted to give deference to illegal immigrants in this country, or more cynically, they were hoping that those illegal immigrants may participate in elections.
Yeah, honestly, I think it's the first. I think that it was this view that if they had a kinder, gentler immigration law, that they would draw people from the center. I think that they thought that people in the center, didn't really like full enforcement of the immigration laws. They liked border security, and they liked the most serious criminal aliens being taken out of the United States. But there were a lot of articles that started to appear. There were actually two things during this period of time, Larry, that are important to keep in mind. One was the start of what we call the sanctuary movement. There were, cities and towns across the United States that stopped assisting in immigration enforcement. Let me just tell you an anecdote that'll really be eye-opening to you. When I was a young trial attorney in San Francisco, California, Border Patrol agents from the Livermore Border Patrol sector, which doesn't exist anymore, would go to the Alameda County Jail every morning and they would look for criminal aliens who were in detention, who were removable, who had overstayed their visas, or more likely had entered illegally. And they would just take them into custody. Alameda County opened their jails to them. Around 2012, 2014, cities like, Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York started declaring themselves sanctuaries. They stopped allowing their cops to cooperate with ICE. They stopped allowing immigration officers into, their detention facilities and their jails to find these criminal aliens. And that simply emboldened the sanctuary jurisdictions. There were a couple of cases that the Obama administration really didn't fight very hard during this period of time, that sort of gave legal a patina of legality to these sanctuary policies.
Okay.
And so it became a vicious circle of, non-enforcement, restrictions, more non-enforcement.
Yeah.
But I think that the way that the Obama administration read the room, and remember, by November 2014, Barack Obama didn't have any more elections that he could participate in as president.
Right.
I think that he was attempting to curry favor with a lot of the people that you see make up the base of the Democratic Party today, college educated whites, particularly women. And, they hoped to also bring in the burgeoning population of Hispanic citizens of the United States. I think that they believed that if they didn't enforce the immigration laws, that would somehow please Hispanic Americans. That they were in some way simpatico with non-enforcement. The
Yeah.
last election certainly showed us that wasn't true. But I think that was the way that they read it. And the second part of that, I think was a happy coincidence for them. Remember, when you talk about the places that migrants generally go to when they enter illegally, we're talking about New York, California, to a degree, Texas, and Florida, but a lot of red states, in a lot of states, California and New York, they were losing residents. The census only counts people. It doesn't count citizens of the United States. And if you go to California, where 10% of the population are unauthorized aliens or illegal aliens, that really makes an electoral difference. So,
Yeah.
particularly when you get around to Los Angeles. When you look at, certain members of Congress, I'm not going to mention names, although take a look at Maxine Waters' district, you'll see that many of the people who live there aren't actually citizens. They don't have the ability to vote. I don't think that the intention was that they would vote illegally in those elections, but because they couldn't vote, that meant that the people who were there would have a stronger vote. There are about
Right.
880,000 people per congressional district. If 20% of those people are unauthorized aliens who can't vote, that makes it a whole lot easier to win an election.
And it gives those states more representation in the House of Representatives than the actual voting public and the citizens of that state. And that also translates to the Electoral College vote because those members of the House of Representatives translate into electoral votes for the state. This is a great backgrounder for us in a historic perspective, Mr. Arthur. One more question on the history here, and then I want to move us forward to what's going on right now. But that has to do with sanctuary city policies, as you just laid out. Sanctuary cities and sanctuary counties, sanctuary states, they were sold to the American people with a very heart-wrenching kind of message. Victims of crimes who may be in this country illegally, we were told, would be hesitant to report those crimes or seek assistance from the police because those people feared that they would be deported. So therefore, they were suffering as victims of crime. That's what we were told. And they wanted to give sanctuary to illegal immigrants in this country to report crimes in their communities so that they didn't have any fear of being deported. Was there any historical basis for that policy? I don't remember anybody being deported because they reported being a victim of a crime.
Yeah, no, there wasn't. And in fact, we would go to great lengths to ensure that individuals who had been victims of crime, weren't subject to immigration enforcement because of that. And another thing to keep in mind, Larry, we hear this all the time, about these, women primarily who come to the United States, marry United States citizens, are treated abominably, and then the American, spouse says, if you go, if you want to get a divorce or you leave me, I'm going to go to immigration, and we're going to make sure that you get deported. Basically, it's a way of keeping those people in a virtual servitude and bondage within their own households. Uh, we knew that, and we deliberately didn't go after those people. In addition, Larry, Congress created, the T visa for trafficking victims, so they'd come forward, and the U visa for people who were victims of crimes.
Mhm.
Specifically, so if we came upon one of these people and we wanted to use them, state and local wanted to use them as witnesses in those crimes, they could offer them a visa that would allow them to stay in the United States
Right.
legally. But
Yeah.
here's really the next part, and this gets to a bigger issue that you alluded to. There's no science behind this whatsoever. If you talk, whenever you listen to these chiefs of police elected or, elected prosecutors, they'll tell you, well, it makes it a lot more likely that people come forward and report crimes, if we don't, turn over criminals to immigration. There is no science behind that whatsoever. That's a theory, and it's one that the center has attempted to, prove or disprove in reality, and
Yeah.
been unable to find it. We find that Hispanic Americans, who make up the bulk of the unauthorized population in the United States, are no more or less likely to go to the police in sanctuary jurisdictions than they are in non-sanctuary jurisdictions. But here's really the critical part. And again, this is my theory. I can't quantify it. I actually think, one, we know that alien criminals are more likely to prey in immigrant communities. You commit your crimes where you live, and most of them live in immigrant communities. I think that it's a lot more likely that people in those communities, in sanctuary communities, won't go to the police because they know that those people who harm them, who rob them, who rape them, aren't going to be deported at the end of the day. They know they live in sanctuary communities too. There was a notable case in Northern Virginia about a year ago involving an individual who had engaged in sexual abuse on a local running trail. After this individual was arrested and the facts of that case came out, many more people came forward and said, he did the same thing to me, I just didn't go to the police. In Northern Virginia, everybody who is here legally goes to the police. But if you're not here legally, you know the game, you know how this is going to go down. You don't want that person back in your community to harm you because you snitched on them. Many
Yeah.
of these people come from Latin American countries where snitching results in retribution. So I actually think that sanctuary cities are completely backward. And I wish that that's an issue that Congress would examine and that, academics would examine. We would get to a result one way or the other, but it's not within their political interest to do so.
So it sounds like the theory is, and it certainly makes sense, that the entire basis of the sanctuary policies were created without any science or data to back up the rationale behind them. And ironically, it ends up harming the people of immigrant communities, even those who are in this country illegally, as victims of those crimes, because they know ultimately their perpetrator is not going to get deported. Therefore, they're more reticent to report those crimes. It's completely upside down. All right, that's a great background for us and great history on how we got here. Let's talk about where we are right now with the Trump administration. And for those who are just joining the stream, we're speaking with Andrew Arthur. He's a resident fellow in law and policy for the Center for Immigration Studies, and he has a long track record legislatively on Capitol Hill and also as an immigration judge. President Trump's enforcement policies right now, as we've seen, pretty well documented and publicly displayed with the border czar Tom Homan and the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. They're busting the bad guys, they're deporting them, they're sending them out. Is there anything really different going on right now than maybe under the Clinton administration or maybe under the Bush administration, more accurately, since that was during the Department of Homeland Security. Clinton was INS, which is different than ICE and DHS because 9/11 changed everything. So let's go to George W. Bush. Is Trump doing anything radically different with regard to enforcing immigration policy than maybe President Bush did, or even the early days of President Obama?
At the street level, absolutely not. I mean, the one thing that they're doing differently, Larry, is that they're, going out on the streets and finding these people, in their houses or, actually on the street. And the reason that they have to do that is because of the sanctuary policies you and I just talked about. Back, in the INS days and, San Francisco, we didn't have to go into Oakland, California to find somebody at their house. I mean, going into Oakland, California is scary enough. Looking for a, known criminal at their house is really scary. We could just pick them up in the jails, which is a controlled setting. And that's where ICE or, the old INS would prefer to do their business. Because we have these sanctuary policies, you'll see, Tom Homan, Kristi Noem, Kash Patel going out, into the community and arresting people. That's the part that's different. But it's not because, they've changed their strategy. It's because they have to go out into the streets to houses to find those individuals. It's very dangerous for our
Yeah.
ICE officers. And somebody's really going to get hurt. Not only is it a danger to the ICE officers, it's a danger to the aliens they're looking for, of course, because when they run, anything could happen. But more importantly, it's a danger to the community, to all of the people around them. When they start running, when,
Okay.
people start getting excited,
Sure.
people get hurt.
Okay, so other than that aspect of it, and that's again because of the policies in these dominantly blue Democrat cities that have decided to set up sanctuaries, and they don't actually make the transfer to federal law enforcement in the jail cell or in the police station instead of out on the streets. Other than that, pretty much the same policy. So here's why I'm confused, Andrew Arthur. We've got judges, federal judges, blocking many of the deportation efforts of the Trump administration. If the law has not changed and judges allowed it to happen under previous presidents, what is the legal rationale for judges blocking these efforts now?
Well, there is one big change between the Trump administration and what they're doing today, and what has happened in the past. In March, the president issued Presidential Proclamation 10903, in which he, explained that he's going to use the Alien Enemies Act in order to remove individuals of a gang I never even heard of up until 3 years ago, Tren de Aragua, or TDA. TDA is a Venezuelan prison gang that started at Tocoron prison in the Aragua state of Venezuela that followed migrant trails of individuals in the Venezuelan diaspora out of Venezuela into Colombia, through Chile, into Brazil, and up, into Central America. Up until Joe Biden, Tren de Aragua didn't leave South America. And they engage in a lot of very sophisticated crimes. In fact, Larry, if I told you that TDA runs a gold mine in Venezuela, you probably wouldn't believe me. But we
Wait,
do know that,
a gold mine?
yeah, they
A
run a gold
gold
mine. I believe
I
it's
thought gangs did like, they dealt with drugs and maybe extortion, maybe some prostitution. A gold mine?
not just a gold mine, Larry. It's the fourth largest gold mine in the world, as I understand it. And they caused a lot of trouble in Venezuela. And as you know,
And that's why
Venezuela.
Maduro got rid of them. That's why he put them on planes and sent them to America.
And what President Trump has stated, and if you actually look at the South American reporting, you'll see that there's a lot of truth to this. That Tren de Aragua is now in league with a cartel that Cartel de Soles that Maduro himself runs. We know that from indictments in the United States. And they basically struck a deal where TDA is not going to do its business in Venezuela, or if it does, it's going to do it under the aegis of the Venezuelan government. But that leaves them free to go prey upon communities in Colombia and throughout Central America, and especially in Chile. Chile is a special case. Colombia, as you know, has dealt with various drug cartels, drug gangs that started out with political Marxist political ideologies, but that quickly started funding their activities with by moving drugs, growing cocaine or growing poppies, making cocaine, moving cocaine to finance their activities. And they've really moved away from the ideological part. Now they're really just in the drug business.
Yeah.
So Colombia is sort of used to dealing with organizations like the FARC, which is one of these Marxist drug gangs. Chile isn't. Chile had never had any experience in dealing with transnational criminal organizations like this. And when TDA showed up, it was a problem for them. A local prosecutor that I cited in one of my recent pieces said, they see the most heinous crimes going on there ever since TDA showed up. People tortured and brutalized before they're murdered. But there's one particular murder that took place in Chile, in Santiago, that's important. And that was the kidnapping of Ronald Ojeda. Mr. Ojeda was an oppositionist. He'd been a military officer. He attempted to lead a coup against the Maduro regime. He was briefly imprisoned. He was released. And then he went to Santiago, where he was living under the protection of the Chilean government. One day, one February day, a group of Chilean police officers showed up at his door and took him into custody, or what he thought was Chilean police officers. The Chilean government now alleges that the individuals who, came and, got him, who took him away, were actually members of Tren de Aragua. And they were led by an individual known as El Turco, who is identified as the leader of TDA in Chile. Mr. Ojeda's body was found and he was killed. His body was found encased in concrete. And, the Chilean government got very, very angry about this. They went looking for El Turco and the other people who were involved. Well, guess where they found El Turco, Larry? They found him in Texas, in a human trafficking operation in Texas in December. And he's currently facing extradition back to Chile. Wow. To face charges in connection with the killing of Ronald Ojeda. That was a political offense that was carried out. When you talk about TDA to most Americans, or you follow most major American outlets, it's a bunch of guys running around apartment complexes in Aurora, Colorado, carrying AR-15s and engaging in low-level gang activity, the sort we're all familiar with. This is a sophisticated criminal operation. This is like La Cosa Nostra or the mafia, with, carrying out political hits. And that is the basis of what President Trump was, focusing on when he issued Presidential Proclamation 10903.
Right.
And part of PP 10903, as I mentioned, was using the Alien Enemies Act, which permits the president to remove, nationals of a given country out of the United States when there's been an invasion or predatory incursion of this country by, a group or groups. And, he has identified, TDA's activities in the United States as being a predatory incursion. And he has invoked the Alien Enemies Act.
Right.
The Alien Enemies Act is completely different from the Immigration and Nationality Act. That's the law that I'm used to enforcing.
Right.
This one, goes back to 1798. But it's currently codified, 50 U.S. Code, Section 21. It's not a dead law.
If I can jump in on this, because these groups, these foreign groups wreaking havoc in this country, they don't have to have a direct affiliation with a foreign government for the Alien Enemies Act to be enforced. But in this case, they actually do. You've just said there are dots connected right to the Maduro regime and the Venezuelan government. So it seems like it's completely reasonable within the president's authority to do this. So the federal judges just don't like it. They don't like it because it's an old law. That's the big difference here in terms of how they can step in and say, no, you can't do that.
So what the judges have been saying all along, this all started with Chief Judge James Boberg of the District Court for the District of Columbia, who on a Saturday morning into afternoon into evening issued an order, telling DHS, telling the Trump administration not to move any suspected TDA members under the Alien Enemies Act. At the time that he issued that order, apparently, and the timeline is really unclear, planes carrying TDA members who were removed under the Alien Enemies Act were in the air. And he got very angry. He wanted to know everything that was going on. He wanted to know, why they didn't comply with this order. And he accused them of all sorts of malfeasance. That case is still going on.
Yeah.
That part is interesting because the Supreme Court, and the case is called JGG versus Trump, the Supreme Court said Judge Boasberg doesn't have jurisdiction over those cases. For aliens who are removed under the Alien Enemies Act, they get judicial review, or they have, the opportunity to have judicial review, but it's only in habeas. And under the great writ of habeas, habeas can only be sought in the jurisdiction in which you're actually being held. None of these people were being held in DC, Larry. And they told him, they told Judge Boasberg, you don't have jurisdiction. And they also said that review of these cases is limited. Right now, the courts are, attempting to flesh out, the parameters of what review is appropriate. Again, remember, in order to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, the president uses his foreign policy powers because he has to determine that this is a foreign group that's engaged in an invasion. So it's partially his powers as commander in chief, and it's partially his foreign policy powers.
Right.
Those are two powers of the president that courts do not get involved in for two reasons. One, they don't have jurisdiction. Two, they don't have the competence. And
Okay.
that's really the issue. They want to get involved in these things. They don't really know what they're talking about.
So let's break this down, because as you've just really, really thoroughly laid out for us, sir, and I appreciate it, we've got two different laws in place here. We've got our regular immigration laws and deportation protocols that you would preside over as an immigration judge. And then you've got this Alien Enemies Act, which was employed for the TDA folks, some of the MS-13 folks as well. So let's deal with that one first, because I think it might be simpler. Is there due process in place historically in this country where if the president or the president's administration through national security says, hey, you're a member of this group that the president has determined is an enemy and should be deported under the Alien Enemies Act, what is the due process if that person says, no, 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 I'm not a member of that group?
And that really gets to a fundamental issue, Larry, that a lot of people, soi disant experts, really get hung up on. When we talk about due process, we're talking about the due process clause of the Constitution. And, we sort of throw those two words together, but we forget about the fact that the first word is due. That adjective is there for a reason. It is the process that you are due. This law has only been invoked on 3 occasions, and they were all invoked during war, starting in 1812 and ending in World War II. Courts actually allowed a certain level, not a lot, of process to individuals who were removed, who were subject to the Alien Enemies Act in the past. When we talk about aliens generally, Larry, we refer to what's called a spectrum of rights. That spectrum of rights begins when an alien is at a port of entry or immediately crosses the border. So if a migrant crosses the Rio Grande and is caught by Border Patrol, the Supreme Court has held those aliens only have the rights that Congress has given them. Due process is whatever process in that situation Congress has said is due. That spectrum of rights then extends to people who are here unlawfully, then to people who are here on non-immigrant visas as tourists or students, and then to people who have green cards. Even green card holders don't have all the rights that citizens have under the Constitution. They don't have the same level of due process rights. So when you hear a lot of the president's opponents say, well, if Trump's doing this today, he's going to start deporting Americans tomorrow. No, he's not. He can't. Because we receive the full panoply of rights that our wise founders put into place when they published the Bill of Rights in the 18th century. But every one of those aliens that I described has some level of process that's due, but it's more limited than it is for United States citizens, and it depends upon what status they have here.
Okay, so let's first begin with people who are in the country illegally. They're undocumented, right? And you were an immigration judge. Let's first define what that means, because I think people think that that means you were a federal judge under the jurisdiction of Article 3 in the Constitution, and it's, your typical courtroom and all of those protocols and all those things. Is that the same thing, or is an immigration judge a different kind of judge in a different kind of courtroom?
It's a very different kind of judge, Larry. The definition of immigration judge in the Immigration and Nationality Act is a lawyer in the Department of Justice. And, when I was an immigration judge, I had a black robe. I, sat on a bench up on a dais. I had a big seal behind me and an American flag. But I was really just an administrative judge and the lowest level of administrative judge that we have in our federal system. It's important to note the fact that, when we think about adjudications at the federal level, we think about the Article 3 courts you just talked about. Most of the adjudications that take place at the federal level actually take place at the administrative level.
Hmm.
Agencies themselves make determinations. Boards of contract appeals, which every department has, make decisions involving, millions, billions of dollars every year. A lot of that stuff, a lot of the decisions, most of the decisions made in the federal government are made at that administrative level. And that's true in immigration as well.
Okay.
So yes, the authority to interpret the laws of the United States, the immigration laws, and to apply them belongs to the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. Pam Bondi can't hear 4 million cases.
Right.
So she has delegated her authority down to immigration judges to make that determination for her. From there, there's an appeal to an administrative appellate body called the Board of Immigration Appeals. Again, the BIA, as it's known, are also, employing Attorney General Bondi's authority. Finally, Attorney General Bondi ultimately has that authority for herself. She can delegate it, but she ultimately retains it, and she can issue decisions herself if she wants to. And that's how that system works, Larry.
So when you see senators and congressmen claiming that illegal immigrants who are facing deportation or who have been deported have been denied their due process, and yet the track record shows that they've had multiple appearances before immigration judges, and immigration judges have issued deportation orders. Is it accurate to say that they haven't received due process? Because I'm told now, first it was about a Maryland man and he's a father and he's innocent and he's, Mr. Abrego Garcia. But now we find out there's a whole lot of paperwork showing that he did have days in front of immigration judges. He did have appeals. That is due process, isn't it?
That's the essence of due process. It's the essence of due process in our system. And the courts have, regularly upheld, that immigration court to BIA system. In fact, Larry, generally in, the immigration enforcement system, we jump over the district courts. If you are an alien who's been ordered removed and the Board of Immigration Appeals has, sustained an immigration judge's order, you have to ask the circuit court to take your case. You don't get an automatic appeal. It's discretionary on the part of circuit court judges whether or not you're even going to get an appeal. Much like, as we think of with the Supreme Court, you file a petition for writ of certiorari with the Supreme Court. Supreme Court can say no for any reason that it wants. Same is true in the immigration court system. 98, 99% of all immigration adjudications take place in the administrative system I've just described, and courts have regularly said that's due process as far as the Constitution is concerned.
And it may be confusing for people because we know as U.S. citizens, we have a different type of due process, but that's, as you just laid out, due to us because we're U.S. citizens, unlike someone who came into the country admittedly illegally, even if they've been here 10 or 15 years. Does the length of time you're in the country have a bearing on whether you're given more due process or not?
That's one of those questions that the courts have never answered. It does appear that it will have some bearing as you stay here. And this is one of the biggest issues with what the Biden administration did, not so much at the border, but in the interior of the United States. The longer that you stay here and the more equities that you build up in this country, putatively, the amount of process that you are due increases. Courts have never really fleshed this out because honestly, this has never really been that big an issue in the past. It's only when the federal courts start interposing themselves into that system that has existed since the 1940s, and start looking at these things and become immigration experts, again self-described, that we really get into issues with any of this. So yeah, that's putatively they do have more authority. We definitely give them, if it's discretionary relief, we give them more discretion. but it's sort of a fine line between discretion and process in that instance.
I got to think for you watching these cable news shows and have these self-described experts on there getting everything wrong. It's got to be like a former NFL quarterback watching a game on Sunday, and the commentators are just completely out to lunch and don't know what it's like to play on the field. You're yelling back at CNN on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, and that is exactly the way that this goes. And I hear people say just outrageous things, outrageously wrong things. And at least I have the benefit of working for the Center for Immigration Studies, doing interviews like this, writing a blog every day, so I can vent my spleen about everything that's
Yes.
wrong in this. But it is a rich thing. But again, I do have this experience, and
Yeah.
I do break it down for people so that they can understand it. I just wish that CNN, MSNBC,
Oh,
NPR would take a look at my blog from time to time and sort it out for
you
themselves.
and me both. We spent a lot of time on this program, wishing that they could all be better. But we're doing a deep dive here. If you're just joining the live stream, on immigration, immigration law, deportation law, protocols, due process, and national security. This is Andrew Arthur. He's a resident fellow in law and policy at Center for Immigration Studies with a very long history in this field. In fact, I'd like to go back in history for a second now, if you don't mind, because we did draw this distinction between INS, that's what we all grew up hearing, INS, Immigration Naturalization Services. After 9/11, a lot of these organizations and agencies in the federal government were reorganized and put under the umbrella of Department of Homeland Security. There was a reason for that. Our porous border was seen as one of the vulnerabilities that our nation had to fix so that we wouldn't have another 9/11. In fact, if I remember right, a good chunk of the terrorists, if not all of them, that committed the 9/11 atrocities had overstayed their visas or had entered the country illegally. So, Mr. Arthur, since you sort of went through that process and went through that transition, and saw the re-emphasis on national security tied directly to our border security and immigration and deportation policies. Please give me your perspective about our vulnerabilities right now, how we've sort of lost the plot in terms of why this is such an essential part of our security.
No, and very quickly, there were 19 hijackers on September 11th. There was a 20th one involved as well, and various individuals who were tangentially related. And in the wake of the September 11th attacks, the 9/11 Commission, which was bipartisan, convened by President Bush, looked at all the vulnerabilities that we had, and Congress passed a number of laws to implement those, to implement changes to plug those vulnerabilities. Starting with the USA Patriot Act, which a lot of people don't like, but I wrote the parts that people do like.
I
Up through the
appreciate it.
Homeland Security Act, the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004, and the Real ID Act of 2005, which is coming due 20 years too late. But each one of those things was implemented in response to an actual finding of the 9/11 Commission. There was a vulnerability that allowed these people to live, move around, and work in the United States. One of the key findings in the 9/11 Commission, and this is, on page 388, I think, is in the years leading up to September 11th, border security was not considered to be an aspect of national security. There were debates about how many or how few aliens should come into the United States and about drug smuggling, but no emphasis whatsoever on the individuals who would come here to harm the national security.
Yeah, if I
That's a
may, because I remember I lived in California at the time, and our border security and our immigration policy was almost always discussed within the context of the economy, within jobs and economic issues, sometimes some cultural and language issues about how an influx of immigrants from various parts of the country might affect a community. But it was very rarely spoken in through the context of national security and the sort of protection of our homeland.
Yeah, no, and the 9/11 Commission specifically, was impaneled and made those recommendations, and Congress acted on a bipartisan basis to plug the gaps that the 9/11 Commission had identified. Which is why when people come here legally, when they go to the consulate, when they get a visa, they have to show that they don't have a criminal history abroad. They have to show that they aren't members of groups dedicated to the overthrow of the United States, or to groups that would adversely affect the foreign policy of the United States. One of the things that I've discovered, Larry, in the course of my, investigation of the Biden administration of the last 4 years, is that many of the people who were making those decisions were teenagers, if they weren't in diapers at the time that the 9/11 Commission issued its report and that the 9/11 Commission attacks happened, which is probably why, to the degree that they ever had any use for the 9/11 Commission report, it was as a doorstop to hold open their door in the executive office building. So,
Mm.
all of the lessons that we had learned on September 11th, all of the laws that we had implemented were basically ignored. We opened we had, secured the front door, and then the Biden administration opened the back door. When people enter illegally, when they, cross the border illegally, or they show up at the ports without proper documents, we don't know anything about them. They've skipped over that vetting system abroad. And in the case of a country like Venezuela, we're never going to know anything about those individuals because Nicolas Maduro hates the United States and would love to overthrow it.
Yeah.
So they're not going to tell us, who's a criminal, who's a TDA member, who's a child molester, who served time in a mental institution. When Donald Trump was on the campaign trail, he was derided for saying that Maduro opened his jails and his mental institutions. And you would see a lot of fact checks. There's no facts that support that. Reporters are supposed to actually go figure out what's happening, not fact check Donald Trump. But that's how they spent most of that time,
Yeah.
and explains why we're in the situation we're in today.
Well, and the sources oftentimes on those fact checks were the Biden administration saying, "Oh, no, 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 that's not true." But it is true. And by the way, let's talk about this for a second, because we have learned that there were plenty of people led into this country under those auspices that you just described. But is it true that we, in fact, deliberately, proactively flew people into this country? It's not like they came to our border and we just let them in. We actually, the US government under the Biden administration, went out of our way to fly people in from some of these countries?
Fly them in at a rate of up to 30,000 people per month from Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Haiti.
Wait, wait,
Venezuela.
wait, wait, wait. I'm sorry. You just said that the president of Venezuela hates America. We do not, and we have this adversarial relationship with them. In fact, I think the Biden administration's official position was that he was not officially the president, that it was a
That's
rigged election. Why on earth would we proactively bring in thousands of people from a country where the leader hates us? What, that's a suicide mission.
Do you want to know the real answer, Larry? I'll
Yeah.
tell you. Joe Biden had a significant political issue, he had a number of them, leading up to the 2024 election. And that was, thanks to people like you, people like me. The American people were finally waking up to the fact that millions of unvetted aliens were pouring into the United States, that they were crossing illegally, and that they were overwhelming Border Patrol agents. So, in order to allow those would be illegal migrants to bypass that system so they wouldn't show up in those Border Patrol apprehension stats that were so awful for the president every month, he allowed, again, 30,000 nationals of that country per month to fly directly into the United States. They flew into domestic airports, or international airports in the United States. And for that reason, they didn't show up in the Border Patrol apprehension statistics, each month. 360,000 people per year. I think it was more than 500,000 who came in under this program. But remember the point you just made. Not only does Venezuela not like us, Cuba doesn't like us, and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua don't like us, and none of these people have really liked us for decades.
Right.
So we had no way of vetting those individuals. In fact, if you go back in time, you'll see that nobody really took responsibility for this. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services said, we administer the program, but we don't really adjudicate these things. CBP officers at the ports were left, with these people showing up with the paroles that USCIS had given them, and they didn't really know what to do with them. They didn't have any way to vet them. They don't have access to Venezuelan criminal databases or Chilean or Colombian ones either.
And
Yes,
then and then
this was
they get here and they disappear.
they get here and they disappear.
And they never show up. And now, and this was done under, first of all, the Humanitarian Parole Program. This is CHNV. I know you're familiar with. They came from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, over 500,000, over 500,000. immigrants brought in under that program. And then under the temporary protected status program, that was a lot of the Haitians, but also some other nationalities came in. Trump is now removing those temporary statuses, those temporary protections they had. And I'm seeing headlines and I'm seeing Democrats screaming that this is awful, this is terrible, you can't do this. Doesn't that whole temporary part, doesn't that mean that it's not permanent? That mean, what, can't a president say, okay, you don't get that temporary protective status anymore?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, this is purely discretionary on the part of the executive branch. Congress gave, then INS this authority back in the 90s with the idea that it would be temporary. Take Montserrat, for example. Montserrat, for about 6 months had temporary protected status. It's an island in the Caribbean, and they had a volcano, and that volcano wiped out about 40% of the island. So we said, if you're a native of Montserrat and you're here, you got temporary protected status for 6 months. And at the end of that 6 month period, we revoked it and nobody really complained.
Right.
When it comes to these Central American, countries and South American countries, however, they start to create their own constituencies in the United States that want that to continue. El Salvador has had temporary protected status. Remember, temporary, Larry, has had temporary protected status since 2000 in response to Hurricane Mitch. Hurricane Mitch was cleaned up 6 months later, but 25.
I'm sorry, did you just say 2000? Because it's 2025 right now, Judge. You said this is 25 years they've had temporary status for El Salvador?
Yeah, and various administrations, primarily.
That's a heck of a hurricane.
Well, so when it comes time to re-up TPS, it's coffee rust or something. Coffee rust is literally one of the excuses that they've used for continuing temporary protected status for Salvadorans in the United States. But you talked about the countries that have gotten TPS, temporary protected status. Venezuela was one of them. In fact, this migrant surge from Venezuela was largely triggered by the fact that Alejandro Mayorkas, the impeached Secretary of Homeland Security, in March of 2021 decided to designate Venezuela for temporary protected status. Here's a stat for you, Larry. In the years leading up to the Biden administration, about 5,000 Venezuelan nationals total were apprehended entering the United States illegally. As soon as Mayorkas implemented temporary protected status, we were getting hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan nationals coming every year. In fact, when he re-implemented it, and I could explain why he re-implemented it, that's no better. But in 2024, 731,000 Venezuelans were eligible for temporary protected status in the United States. When you're talking about a population that big, it's never going to be temporary unless an administration like this one takes the steps that it did. And now it's being blocked in doing that.
Amazing. By the way, just to be fair, full disclosure, I mean, I've been to Montserrat. It's right off Antigua. It's a beautiful. I mean, given the choice, I would probably go back to Montserrat after 6 months of a volcano. El Salvador, maybe at the time at least, a different situation. I want to wrap things up here with one more question. We're speaking with Andrew Arthur, doing a deep dive in immigration policies, deportation policies, the national security aspects, and most importantly, this whole due process thing we keep hearing in the news from people who don't really know what the due process is. So I want to go back to that, if I may. You were an immigration judge. This was your job. This was your life. You would have people brought into you who were apprehended in the country illegally. They made their case to you. Sometimes I'm guessing they claimed that they were eligible for amnesty, and it was your job to determine whether they should be deported. So one quick thing I want to hit on, because a lot of people say these are refugees that they want. I love hearing this all the time. They're asking for sanctuary and amnesty here in the United States because they want a better job, a better life, and to make money. Is that grounds for amnesty?
No, absolutely not. To get asylum in the United States, you have to show either past persecution or well-founded fear of future persecution on account of your race, your religion, your nationality, your membership in a particular social group, or your political opinion. It's not eligible. It's not available to people fleeing war. It's not, available to people fleeing economic privation. If that was the standard, Larry, we have the highest standard of living in the world. Everybody would come here and everybody would be eligible.
And you're right. Thank you. Asylum was the word I was thinking of. I was saying amnesty, but that's it. There are very, very specific statutory definitions of what makes someone eligible for asylum, and being poor and wanting to make more money here to help their family, as wonderful as that may be, and I get it, that's, we're a great country, that's not grounds for asylum. All right, so these people come into you and you're the judge and you make a determination. How many cases did you see per day average?
I would see 21 cases per day, and I would issue generally one or two asylum decisions every day. And I know what your next question is going to be, and it's going to
Go
be how
ahead.
many of these people actually get granted asylum on a over a wide span of time, going all the way back to 2008. Only about 17% of people who were, who entered illegally ended up getting granted asylum.
Okay.
All of the rest of them either didn't show up for court. And keep in mind, Larry, more than a third of all people don't show up for court, or they applied and they were denied. I was in a detained court. My grant rate, according to the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, was 9%. A lot of that had to do with the fact that I saw a number of criminals who just weren't eligible. But
Yes.
yeah, I mean, most of these Central
So
American claims are not valid and they're just denied.
if we have 15, 20, I mean, what's your guess in terms of how many millions of cases that right now are waiting for a hearing? We should know that number, right? Shouldn't we be able to push a button and spit out the number of pending hearings?
It's just over 4 million pending hearings before
Oh, all right.
720 immigration judges. But they're
So
also,
the other numbers are not pending hearings. The other numbers are just people who are in the country illegally and they don't even have any sort of court date at this point.
that's correct. And there are also
Okay.
more than a million other cases that are over at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's the
Okay.
bad news. Can I give you some good news, Larry?
Please.
The good news is that ever since the Trump administration sealed the border, and I was down in San Diego 3 weeks ago, nobody's coming across that border. The backlog in the immigration courts has dropped. It dropped by about 100,000 cases, and that's the first time that's happened since 2008. The Donald Trump's credo is you patch the boat and then you bail the boat. In this case, the side of the boat is the border, and the water in the boat is the unauthorized population in the United States. If we simply enforce the laws, as a district court judge found when ruling in the Biden administration's favor, this system works. But the problem is that it's become a mix of political rancor and ego. And that continues. She made that determination of the Biden administration. But unfortunately, as we see from her fellow district court judges today, the political rancor and the ego continues.
Well, the system works and it may even work efficiently, but is it even possible for it to take care of the problem? The boat is patched, yes. But if going through regular due process now, as currently dictated, for the millions of backlogged asylum cases, as well as those who may be apprehended being here illegally, that you're even off the radar and they get their day in court to be able to determine whether they should be deported, how long would it reasonably take based on the current number of judges that we have?
And I can answer that question, Larry. And this gets to Congress's responsibility. If you remember, Joe Biden, when the awful Senate border bill that nobody ever read, but everybody said was great, was going through the process when Donald Trump purportedly stopped it. Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris said Congress needs to act in order for us to, get the system under control. That wasn't true. But today we do need Congress to act. And it's not by changing the laws, although there are a few things we could change. It's money. Tom Homan needs about $185 million from Congress in order to expand detention space and expand the number of judges on the bench, expand the number of ICE prosecutors, expand the number of immigration enforcement agents to actually move these people out of the United States. If you were to double the size of the immigration court, to 1,400, and you were to double the amount of bed space, it's 46,000 beds right now. If we were to double that to 92,000, most of those people, we could get those people through the process in about the same period of time I took. I would hear cases. I'd be done in, sometimes cases would be done in 3 days, sometimes they'd be done in 21 days, but in no situation did it ever take 2 months or more. So, when you detain people, they don't stick around. They don't file stupid motions. They don't argue idiotic points. They want their case heard, or they admit they don't have a claim and they go home. But here's really the important thing that the Trump administration is doing. And this is as important as what's going on at the border. People aren't talking about it. Secretary Noem is requiring every alien in the United States to register. If you're here, illegally, you have to register with the foreign government, with the U.S. government. We know from, when we had a similar registration program after September 11th, that for every one person who was removed through that registration process, 10 will leave. So, when that goes into effect, a lot of people who, came to the United States, who thought they had an invitation from Joe Biden, are going to go. And
Yeah.
that's especially true when, Tom Homan hits the streets, the agents hit the streets, and
Right.
that's not going to be reflected. The president's critics are going to say, oh, Obama deported more people. We could talk about that. There was a lot of book
It
cooking
was
there.
turnarounds at the gate. That's not the same thing. They
Exactly.
call
But,
it the
the
gate.
total illegal population is going to drop. It's probably going to drop by about 1 million people per year, in addition to the number of people who are physically removed from the United States.
So quickly, and I'm out of time, but in summary, cutting off benefits for illegal immigrants in this country, making illegal immigrants register with DHS, and making a public show of deportations, as we've seen with these videos of arrests on the streets and deportations. Those three things combined will actually pretty rapidly reduce the number of illegal immigrants in this country without us having to put people on a plane. They're just going to, self-deport. They'll go home on their own.
And I say that as a person who's got almost 34 years of experience in this field, who's seen every different kind of migration you can imagine.
Well, let's see if Congress has the will to back up those policies, as you said. Andrew Arthur, I cannot thank you enough, and Center for Immigration Studies. This has been a great deep dive. I'm smarter because of it, so I know our audience is smarter because of it. And hopefully, everyone who watches this or listens to this will be smarter, and we can have a smart, intelligent conversation about these very important national security issues. Thank you so much.
Larry, thank you so much for having me.
And that is it for this special edition of the program. Thanks for watching. Thanks for liking and subscribing and sharing, especially if you learned something new today, something that maybe your friends, family members, and coworkers get wrong all the time about this issue. Well, share this with them so that they can be as smart as you. In the meantime, we'll see you next time. My name's Larry O'Connor, and you can call me Larry.